So we're going to go through the last chapter in the book. It's chapter 15 on hallucinogens, fantasticants, and club drugs. There are a bunch of drugs in this chapter. For the purposes of testing and what you need to know, you can focus on LSD, ecstasy, and PCP. But I'm going to talk to you about all these different drugs just because I think it's important for you to be aware of them. So hallucinogens are a bunch of different types of drugs that we'll talk about, and this is just a list of other names that they're called or have been called in the past. They're named after specific effects that they have. So fantasticants, the idea there is that they cause fantastic perceptual experiences. Phantasmagoria is a strange dreamlike state. Psychedelics are maybe that's obvious. And then entactogen, the name there means touching within, so you're feeling in touch with yourself and having profound insights about yourself and your own experience. And pathogens are so named for their ability to promote empathy, so you're feeling in touch with other people. Psychotomimetics, mimetic means they mimic psychotic-like symptoms, including hallucinations, for instance. And then club drugs, the idea with that name is that they're used in clubs, especially dance clubs, and they enhance the ability someone has to enjoy music and dancing in crowds of people. So first we're going to talk about LSD and other monoamine-like drugs. So we're going to classify these into indolamine-like drugs and catecholamine-like drugs. So indolamine and catecholamine are just chemical structures, and these drugs are just named after which chemical structure they're similar to. LSD acts similarly to serotonin. Psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. The rest of this list you can just read through. Don't feel like you need to memorize the rest of these, but it's just different drugs that are mentioned in your book. And then the major catecholamine-like drug we're going to talk about is, or I want you to be aware of, is mescaline, which is acts similarly to dopamine and norepinephrine. Mescaline is the active ingredient in the peyote cactus in the southwest of the United States, and this has a history of being used in Native American rituals and ceremonies. So for a psychedelic experience with hallucinations and all of that, about 200 micrograms of LSD is a standard dose, or the most commonly cited dose at least. And this can be consumed. The standard way is blotting paper, but that's kind of the way that it was done in the 60s and 70s. Gel tabs are basically having the drug in gelatin, which protects it from deterioration. Window pane is similar to blotting paper, and then microdots are like little candies to consume. Mescaline, again, comes from the dried peyote cactus. It can be eaten orally, or it can be soaked in water and then drank as a beverage. And the typical effective dose for that is 200 to 400 micrograms. So again, LSD is usually taken orally. Its effects begin half an hour to an hour and a half after it's ingested. It has a half-life of about 3 to 5 hours. It is metabolized by liver enzymes, and then only 1% of the drug actually reaches the brain. So in terms of the neurophysiology of LSD, its effects on the nervous system are only somewhat known. It appears to act as a serotonin receptor blocker in the peripheral nervous system, but then in the central nervous system, it acts as a selective agonist at specific serotonin receptors, particularly the 2A receptors. So 5-HT2A receptors are the 2A subtype of serotonin receptors. And this is the case for LSD as well as other indolamine and catecholamine-like hallucinogens. And then the book goes through the 3 different areas of the brain that are involved in the the hallucinogenic effects of these drugs. So the locus coeruleus, the cortex, and the raphe nuclei. And you don't need to know the specifics of that, how it acts at those three locations in the brain, but just know that those three locations in the brain are involved in things like perception, information processing, things like that, and that's what causes the hallucinations that are characteristic of these drugs. So again, we're still talking about LSD and similar drugs here. Their effects on the body, a primary symptom of having taken LSD is dilation of the pupils. Mescaline can cause nausea. And then subjective effects, these have to be studied subjectively because they're subjective experiences. So first we're going to talk about the hallucinations. We rely on verbal reports for these generalizations. So in the first stage of hallucination, the hallucinogenic effects, people report seeing geometric patterns, lattice-like patterns, or funnels, cones, spirals, things like this. And it's similar to people with very low blood sugar or in delirium from high fever or in a hypnagogic state. This is hypnagogic state is right before you fall asleep, when you're kind of in between being conscious and unconscious. So that mental state is similar to a state a person's in when they're under the influence of hallucinogens. And then that was the first stage of hallucinations. A second stage is when people start seeing things come to life. So small animals or friendly humans. They also commonly report religious imagery. And then at high doses, people also see themselves in the hallucination, and complex, meaningful imagery. An example of that is shown in figure 15-1. You can see different images that a person might experience. Fantasticant and perceptual effects. The idea here is that the experience assumes this great emotional significance. And because of these effects of the drugs, they're often used in different religions. They can be used in certain religious ceremonies and rituals. And people also find more meaning in art and music and experiences like that. These drugs have entactogenic and empathogenic effects. So entactogenic is being in touch with yourself, insight into your own past or your own mind. And because of this, these drugs have been proposed to be used as aids in psychotherapy. And then empathogenic means that you've got increased empathy, that you feel more empathy for others. And then finally, effects on perception. People feel like they have sharper, more acute perception. Their sense of sight and sound are more acute. And they also experience time as going more slowly. There's several different effects that LSD and drugs similar to it have on behavior and performance. First, they can decrease motivation. They can also impair reaction time. This is possibly related to the altered perception of time when under the influence of these drugs. They also impair intellectual functioning, so tasks that require higher order thinking are more difficult or are delayed. And then problem solving and cognitive functions are impaired as well. So tolerance to LSD develops rapidly. If LSD is taken continually over time, its effects disappear within a few days. And at that point, you can't up the dose to get an effect. It's just that the effects are gone. But then on the other hand, tolerance also dissipates quickly. So within about a week, and after that, the drug will have effects again. Cross-tolerance with other hallucinogens. Once you have tolerance to LSD, other hallucinogens, you'll have cross-tolerance to. Psilocybin, mescaline, other hallucinogens like that. This excludes THC, the active ingredient in marijuana. And tolerance is mediated by the downregulation, either fewer of the receptors or less sensitive receptors. So the downregulation of the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. Now, possibly because of that tolerance developing so quickly, the last point on here about self-administration, humans don't continually consume these drugs. It's not something that people binge on, like with other drugs that we've talked about. Then going back up to the second point, there's no withdrawal symptoms that have been reported, possibly, again, because people don't take them continually. They don't have that physical dependence. On the other hand, flashbacks or perceptual distortions, similar to the symptoms, the hallucinations that come with the drugs, can persist after stopping the use of the drug. And then again, the last point on here about self-administration, humans don't continually consume these. One big reason is probably because the effects you develop tolerance to the effects so quickly. And so generally people consume these for special occasions or sporadically. We've talked about the religious use before, and it's just kind of an episodic use where the drugs are taken just for special occasions. Okay, then a few of the harmful effects of LSD and other hallucinogens like LSD. First, there's been no recorded deaths from overdose, so that's a harmful effect that does not happen with these drugs. They're just not that toxic. A psychedelic crisis or a bad trip is also called an acute psychotic reaction in this book. And this is just an unpleasant experience with the drug. The problem may be that the person feels that something's real rather than drug-induced, and they're anxious about it, they're panicking about it, they're just freaking out about it. And it's scary for the person, but it's not a medical emergency. They're not in physical danger. It's in their mind, and they really just need to be talked down by somebody who can remind them that this is from the drug. Flashbacks we mentioned on the previous slide. So after the drug's worn off, you can experience some of the same effects of the drug. Typically, it only lasts for a very short time, but it can be unexpected, and it can persist after drug use has stopped. And then trailing phenomena is seeing things in a jerky or choppy way. You can imagine looking at something with a strobe light rather than with ambient light, like where we all see things moving smoothly. So that's called trailing phenomena. So now we're going to move on to the next set of drugs. We focused on LSD and drugs like it on the previous set of slides, and on the slide titles I wrote LSD just to clarify where we were in the chapter. So this next set of drugs is called ecstasy and synthetic mescaline-like drugs, and I'm going to focus on ecstasy in the slide titles and with the examples given. So these drugs are a combination of the catecholamine-like hallucinogens, like mescaline, and amphetamines. These drugs are synthetic rather than derived from plants or other natural sources. So ecstasy is the poster child of this set of drugs. Its chemical name is 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, that's MDMA, but it's also known as a bunch of different street names, which I've written out here. It was originally synthesized by the pharmaceutical company Merck, and they patented it in 1914. It was not there was no use for it until the 1960s, at which time it was given to patients, to clients in therapy, to enhance the intimacy and communication between the clients and the therapists. These are the empathogenic effects and the entactogenic effect that we've talked about already. So these were the original intention. That was the original intention of these drugs. And then other designer drugs, you don't have to know the other drugs in this class, but just focus on this group of drugs. But anyway, DMA, DOM, DOET, there's a bunch of different chemical variations that are similar. So these different designer drugs have similar effects. These drugs were reclassified in 1985, and at that time they were banned. They were made illegal to use they weren't used anymore in therapy because of their neurotoxic effects. These drugs are typically taken orally, usually in pill form. They reach their peak level within a few hours, and they have ecstasy's half-life is about 8 hours, so its effects can persist for several days. And if you follow that through, after 8 hours, it would be at 50% of its level in your blood. After 16 hours, 25%. So then you follow it through, and it's not until 40 hours that it would be down to 1/32 of its peak levels, which is why the book specifically says it can persist for several days after use. And then this next part isn't really pharmacokinetics, but it's in this heading in the book, so I'm covering it here. It's often used by people who go to raves, so that's young people, at dance clubs or raves. And then it's also associated with sex because of how it causes an enhanced perception of sensory experiences, including touch, and you're just more sensitive to that. And then other effects are wakefulness, endurance, energy, euphoria, sharpened sensory perceptions, and extroversion. So all good qualities if you're looking to go to a rave or a dance club until all hours of the night. Now, the neurophysiology of ecstasy and similar drugs, these drugs work at the indolamine and the catecholamine type neurons, so the serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopaminergic neurons. They increase transmission of those neurotransmitters, and they do that in two ways. First, they cause the release of that neurotransmitter, and then they also block that neurotransmitter from being taken back up into the cell. So we've talked about this several times before, but just really quickly, you know that in a normal neuron, after the neurotransmitter has been in the synapse for a little while, that neurotransmitter is either taken back up into the cell or destroyed. And so if you block reuptake, then that neurotransmitter can sit in the synapse for longer and cause its effect for longer. These drugs also cause the release of oxytocin, which is a bonding hormone. This is a hormone that's released naturally at childbirth to establish the bond between the mother and the child. So you can imagine why that hormone that helps establish a bond, a strong bond, would be empathogenic or entactogenic and help at a club scene or what have you. So with this slide, I'm going to cover several of these next sections: behavior and performance. I'm skipping over discriminative stimulus properties, tolerance, and self-administration in humans. So recall that ecstasy is synthesized from both hallucinogens and amphetamines. So a dose of an effective dose, 75 to 100 mg, induces a state similar to that when using marijuana or low doses of PCP, which we'll talk about soon. It also causes entactogenic effects. We talked about those with LSD in the previous section, but being aware of your feelings and emotions and getting in touch with yourself. It also causes increased muscular tension. Bruxism is another name for grinding your teeth or clenching your jaw. And then there's a list of physiological changes here: body temperature increased, headache, nausea, blurred vision, and insomnia. And then as it wears off, it's similar to a crash after using amphetamines, where you have difficulty concentrating, fatigue, and depression. Tolerance develops rapidly to ecstasy's effects. This is similar to what we talked about in the previous section with LSD and mushrooms and mescaline. And then human epidemiology, the number of users increased throughout the 1990s, and along with that, the number of admissions to the emergency room because of these drugs increased as well. Its use has dropped off since then due to the perceived risk of using the drugs. So withdrawal, again, this is similar to what we talked about with LSD. With this class, there's some negative after effects, as I just mentioned on the previous slide. but you don't see true withdrawal because these drugs aren't taken regularly and repeatedly like with other classes of drugs. And then the harmful effects of ecstasy first depletes serotonin. So there's some videos on your learning module that go through this in more detail, but you know the neurophysiology of it is that it increases the release of serotonin and blocks the reuptake of serotonin into the presynaptic neuron. But then eventually that serotonin is depleted. And because of that decreased level of serotonin, you get a whole list of effects that I've listed here: sleep disorders, depression, anxiety. And these effects dissipate after about 6 months of not taking the drug, after the drug has been discontinued. One of the more serious harmful effects of ecstasy is heat regulation. So this increase in body temperature that we talked about could lead to heat stroke, muscle tissue damage, kidney failure, liver damage. And if the brain swells, that can result in epileptic-like seizures as well. So taking those harmful effects from the previous slide a step further, ecstasy can be lethal, and these causes of death, we mentioned some of them on the previous slide. So hyperthermia is overheating. Hyponatremia is basically related to that. It's from drinking too much water. It's diluting out the salts or nutrients in your blood. And that can also lead to swelling of the brain and seizures, which we mentioned on the previous slide as well. Heart and circulatory problems, liver damage have been identified as causes of death after taking this drug, and then suicide and accidents also increase when using this drug. Another problem with the safety of ecstasy is that it can be impure and it can contain other drugs such as amphetamine, ephedrine, and PMA. And then along those lines, consumption of other drugs with ecstasy also greatly increases its lethality. So the book gives numbers of 1 in 1.8 million is the risk of dying when ecstasy is the only drug used, but that increases, it's still fairly rare, but it increases a lot to about 1 in 40,000, 1 in 39,000 when it's combined with other drugs. So salvia, I'm doing this all in one slide just for a really quick overview. This is a psychoactive plant with hallucinogenic effects. It's one of the most potent natural hallucinogens, and its potency is comparable to synthetic hallucinogens. So a dose as low as 200 micrograms can give hallucinogenic effects. And it also has low toxicity, so it's a relatively safe drug. In terms of its neurophysiology, it appears to be a kappa opioid receptor agonist and a partial dopamine receptor agonist on the D2 receptor subtype. Interestingly, it has no effect on the serotonin 2A receptor, which, if you'll recall from a few slides ago, was critical for the hallucinogenic effects of some of the other drugs we've talked about, LSD. It crosses the blood-brain barrier easily. It concentrates in the cerebellum and visual cortex, which accounts for some of its effects, the hallucinogenic effects, and we'll talk about movement effects in a little bit. It's very short acting. It only lasts for a few minutes, 5 to 30 minutes. Recall that this is very different from other hallucinogens, where LSD had a half-life of 3 to 5 hours and ecstasy had a half-life of 8 hours. This drug is very rapidly metabolized, and then its metabolite is inactive. So when it is metabolized, it turns from salvinorin A to salvinorin B. You don't have to know that, but salvinorin B is inactive, so then its effects are gone. So the hallucination is the primary effect of this drug, but then there's also other effects that come from that. Uncontrollable laughter, loss of motor coordination, which I mentioned with the specific parts of the brain that it concentrates in. This can cause altered perceptions and emotional swings. Synesthesia is this crossing over of different senses. So you see music and color, or you can taste a language or something like that. You may have heard of people having this in regular life, not just drug induced. Some people see music or associate colors with days or whatever the case may be. But in any case, this is drug induced synesthesia. The book mentions trying to be more, what's the word? Trying to be more, observe the effects of this drug in a more systematic way, and looking at these videos on YouTube, the effects that are consistently noted are what we've already talked about: hypomovement or hypermovement. So we kind of mentioned movement changes, I guess. Speech deficits, emotional changes. We talked about emotional swings. So nothing shocking there. And then finally, tolerance and withdrawal. Tolerance does not appear to develop, and it possibly even sensitization develops to this drug, where higher doses are needed at first and then later lower doses work. Again, this is very different from other hallucinogens. And then similarly to what we've learned about the other hallucinogens, there's no true withdrawal symptoms, but mild adverse effects are seen when the drug's discontinued, such as headache, insomnia, and irritability. So now this next section is going to be on the dissociative anesthetics, which include phencyclidine and ketamine. Phencyclidine is also known as PCP. PCP is a synthetic drug. It was developed in the early 60s. It's called a dissociative anesthetic because it separates someone from their sensory experience. It causes a numbness or puts them into a trance-like state. So dissociative means, it causes them to dissociate, and anesthetic causes them to not feel or be numb. It was originally developed for pain relief and as an anesthetic, and it worked well for those uses, but then it was withdrawn. It wasn't allowed to be used anymore, withdrawn from the market because of emergence delirium. Patients were reporting delirium, disorientation, agitation. So ketamine was marketed as a safer alternative to PCP in the late 60s. It's a more potent anesthetic. It has a shorter duration of action, and it has milder emergence effects, the delirium and disorientation and agitation I mentioned before. It's primarily used in veterinary settings. It can also be used for children, pediatrics, again as an anesthetic, and it's also known as a date rape drug. You recall Rohypnol back in the sedative section several weeks ago. It's a liquid that is colorless and tasteless, which is why it can be used as a date rape drug. It can be swallowed or injected. We'll talk about routes of administration on the next slide, but the book just mentions it here. So there you have it. So the pharmacokinetics and dosages of these drugs, they're weak lipid-soluble bases. They're effective in a variety of routes of administration. And you know from our previous discussions that these routes of administration will affect the speed of the effects, how quickly they're absorbed, and how quickly they take effect. So inhalation will be the fastest, orally will be the slowest. PCP peaks in 10 to 90 minutes, again, depending on the route of administration. Its effects last for a few hours, 4 to 8 hours. Typical dose is 5 to 10 milligrams. And then again, because it's lipid soluble, it's absorbed into the body fat and can be slowly released over time, even a period of several weeks long before it's completely eliminated from the body. Ketamine is most typically used intranasally or snorted, with effects lasting about 35 to 40 minutes. You recall from the previous slide that it's a lot shorter acting than PCP. And then the typical dosages are about 175 milligrams if it's taken orally, and about 50 milligrams if it's snorted. Now, the neurophysiology of these drugs, they do alter the functioning of several different neurotransmitters, which I've listed here. But the primary effect that I'm going to go through is that they block NMDA receptors. They're an antagonist. So glutamate and aspartate bind these receptors. We haven't really talked about aspartate, but glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. It's all over the brain, and the binding site in those ion channels can normally be activated, but similarly with what happens when alcohol, when one of these drugs is blocking an NMDA receptor, those neurotransmitters are blocked, so they just can't exert their effects. And they're, again, glutamate's the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, so if its effects are blocked, then the neurons that it normally impacts would be blocked. So along that line, these drugs also act as reinforcers due to the impact on glutamate activity and its impact on dopamine. And that's in a manner similar to what we saw with barbiturates and benzodiazepines back in chapter 7. Now, behavior and performance. These drugs can induce amnesia, schizophrenic behavior. At high doses, they can also cause stupor or coma even. NMDA receptors are necessary to form long-term memory, so it's not surprising that these drugs can cause amnesia. They cause relaxation and a feeling of warmth and numbness. Again, they're anesthetics. They cause euphoric feelings. Your body image can be distorted to the extent that you even feel like you're floating in space. And then eventually they can also cause a mild depression that lasts just a day to a week or so. And they can cause other mood changes as well. So like LSD, PCP is typically used occasionally, sporadically, so you don't see tolerance develop regularly, but when it is used every day, tolerance does develop. It takes a few weeks, 2 to 6 weeks is what the book gives as a number, and that tolerance develops to the euphoric effects as well as the pain relief, the analgesic effects, and also to the reinforcing properties, and they mentioned the discriminative stimulus properties of ketamine as well. And then if you do develop a physical dependence, this has been done in non-humans. They've studied withdrawal symptoms after continual use of PCP, and those symptoms are listed here: vocalizations, grinding of the teeth, diarrhea, difficulty staying awake, anxiety, confusion, and tremors. But note that there have been no really complete systematic studies of PCP withdrawal in humans, so we don't know about this as much as about this as we could. So now I'm skipping over the section on self-administration in non-humans, and we are on to self-administration in humans, or human epidemiology is what the book is calling these couple paragraphs. So the patterns of use with PCP are similar to those with LSD, where people use it occasionally, sporadically. They're not often taking it on a regular or daily basis. But unlike with LSD, with PCP, some of these occasional social users can become chronic users. So it's atypical, but it does happen despite the tolerance that develops to the reinforcing effects of these drugs. Generally, PCP is used more in big cities, metropolitan areas, than in other areas of the country. And then ketamine is most commonly used among teenagers, high school students. It's not a common drug, but the book gives a figure of about 2% of high school seniors report use within the last year. And then, just as an aside, much of the ketamine on the market is probably coming from veterinary clinics, where somebody who works there is illegally, diverting some of their medicine that's intended for veterinary use and then selling it on the street. PCP and ketamine have a bunch of different harmful effects. First, a harmful effect that they don't have: they have an unfounded reputation for causing violence and just causing people to act very dangerously and in out of control behavior. But again, this is unfounded, and in fact, they might even calm down aggressive animals. But the harmful effects that they do have include disorientation, agitation, hyperactivity, delirium. You recall this from a few slides ago. This is a set of symptoms called emergence delirium, and this is one reason why PCP wasn't was pulled from the market, wasn't allowed to be used anymore, and why ketamine was supposed to be safer. They also cause neurological damage. There's, in chronic users, a reduction in gray matter volume in specific parts of the brain. You don't have to know these, but in the right middle and the left superior frontal gyrus. And that reduction in the gray matter volume correlates with duration of use. So chronic users who use for a really long time have a larger, it correlates that they have a larger reduction in that volume. Psychotic behavior with both positive and negative symptoms, such that it's indistinguishable from schizophrenia, can result from these drugs. And then these drugs are anesthetics. Remember, we're calling them dissociative anesthetics, so you don't feel pain the same way that you might otherwise. So there's just more accidents, injuries that can contribute to grave harm to a person or even death. Genetic damage and reproduction. These drugs slow the growth of the fetus, of the developing baby. They can precipitate early labor, which isn't good for a baby. They can cause fetal distress, which is things like the heart rate dropping too low, something like that. And then in developing rats, they've been shown to cause neurodegeneration, which isn't good when you want to develop a healthy baby. You don't want cells to be dying that shouldn't be dying. And then finally, lethal effects. A lethal dose of ketamine is about 25 times the effective dose for intranasal administration. Recall from a few slides ago that effective dose for intranasal administration is 50 milligrams. 50 mgs is a typical intranasal dose. So 25 times that would be a really large dose, and that would be lethal. High doses can cause coma, convulsions, breathing problems. Your brain can hemorrhage, that's bleeding in the brain, and even kidney failure. And then the lethal effects can be more dangerous. They're more likely to be lethal if these drugs are mixed with alcohol or barbiturates. So recall from the neurophysiology section that these drugs work in a similar way as alcohol and barbiturates. So these drugs potentiate each other, and their interaction can just be very dangerous. So now the next drug we're going to cover, just one slide again, is called dextromethorphan. This is a synthetic drug that's somewhat similar to opiates. It's structurally similar to opiates, and it's the active ingredient in Robitussin. So its primary purpose is to suppress cough, but when taken in large quantities, it can have drug-like effects. People call this roboing when they take large quantities. And then the primary metabolite of dextromethorphan is called dextromorphan. So the neurophysiology of these drugs, they bind dextromorphan as well as its metabolite dextromorphan. They bind with low affinity to the NMDA receptor complex. This is similar to what PCP and ketamine do. They and also alcohol. So they block the NMDA ion channel, which is the normal neurotransmitters that interact with that ion channel are glutamate and aspartate. So this is the same thing we discussed in the previous section. The metabolite dextromorphan has a greater binding affinity than dextromethorphan to the NMDA receptor, and that'll be important in a minute. I'll go through the pharmacokinetics of it. And then in addition, these drugs are agonists for sigma receptors. And these sigma receptors used to be classified as an opioid receptor. You remember the different opioid receptors that we talked about several weeks ago. So they do have somewhat, they were classified as opioid receptors for a long time, but they aren't anymore. And you really don't have to know anything else about that, but they're agonists to sigma receptors. So the pharmacokinetics, I already told you that this dextromethorphan is converted to dextromorphan in the way that happens is first pass metabolism by liver enzymes. And so, since I already also told you dextromorphan, the metabolite, has more of an effect than dextromethorphan, oral consumption is actually the most effective route of administration in this case, because those liver enzymes that the drug comes in contact with through oral administration when it's being digested, those liver enzymes convert it to a more effective drug. Excuse me. And then, as a side note, there is individual variation in those enzyme levels. So then, therefore, there's individual variation in how fast the drug is converted to dextrofan, and therefore there's variation in how the effects that people can get from this drug. The behavioral effects, when it's taken at regular therapeutic doses, it's a cough suppressant. It has few side effects, but when it's taken at high doses, its effects are similar to PCP and ketamine. These can include ataxia, which is movement problems. It's problems coordinating your muscle movements, dizziness and euphoria, tactile and visual hallucinations. So visual hallucinations, you know what those are. They're things that you see that aren't really there. Tactile hallucinations are things that you feel that aren't really there. So we've talked before about feeling like bugs are crawling in your skin or feeling things like that. Can also cause altered time perception and increased perceptual awareness. GHB, or gamma hydroxybutyrate, is a natural metabolite of GABA. It occurs naturally in your body, and it can act as a neurotransmitter and neuromodulator, which we'll discuss on the next slide. Trade names, when it's sold to treat narcolepsy, it's called Xyrem, and elsewhere, not in the United States, but it can be sold as a treatment for alcoholism, Alcover. In the past, it's been used as a dietary supplement. It's been used among bodybuilders to promote growth. It's been used as a sedative, a recreational drug, and a date rape drug. The FDA banned it, declared it unsafe, and banned it from public sale for those uses in 1990. So now its legal status is a little bit murky. It is a Schedule I drug, so it has abuse potential and no medical use. But when sold as Xyrem, it's a Schedule III drug, which is similar to medical marijuana. So it's a little bit unclear exactly how it stands legally. For pharmacokinetics and dose, it's rapidly absorbed orally. Its effects begin really quickly, 15 to 30 minutes, with a peak between 25 to 45 minutes. Again, that's oral administration. Its half-life is fairly short, at 30 to 50 minutes. At about 10 mg per kilogram of body weight, it acts as a muscle relaxant. And then at a little bit higher doses, 15 to 30 mg per kilogram, it can cause sleep. And at 60 mg per kilogram, it can cause unarousable sleep or even coma for a few hours. Its lethal dose is 300 to 900 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, and its lethality is through almost all deaths caused by this drug are because of cardiorespiratory arrest, so your heart stops working or you stop breathing. And the majority, about 2/3 of the deaths from this drug, also involved another drug as well. So now the neuropharmacology of GHB, recall that it's a natural substance in your body, and there are GHB receptors, so it binds to those receptors. And then at high doses, doses that are higher than what naturally occur, it can also bind to the GABA B receptor. Now, GABA does not bind to the GHB binding site. GHB has it's a distinct binding site in the GABA B receptor. Now, the GHB receptor is part of a complex that releases secondary messengers in the cell, and through those binding sites, by binding those different receptors, it modulates neurotransmitter levels, is the upshot of all of this. It can increase or decrease GABA levels. You don't need to know the specifics. And then it also has an effect on dopamine, and it's another increase or decrease. So it can inhibit the dopamine release from the presynaptic cell, which causes excess dopamine to accumulate in the presynaptic cell. But then after a period of inhibition or at higher doses, there can be a surge of dopamine activity. So it can increase or decrease GABA levels. It can decrease or increase dopamine levels. Its subjective effects include alcohol-like intoxication, which can, it's like being drunk, basically, being under the influence of alcohol. It can cause relaxation, it can cause euphoria, it can decrease sexual inhibition, and also cause amnesia, cause memory problems for people. It's an anxiolytic, and it also normalizes sleep patterns, which makes sense because you'll recall from the previous slide, it's used as a treatment for narcolepsy. So the human epidemiology section, this is a pretty rarely used drug. 0.05% of young people, 16 to 23-year-olds, reported that they had ever used it a decade ago anyway. But the use of this drug might be rising, and the book quotes a study, the Drug Abuse Warning Network, which is a system that monitors drug use. It monitors how often the specific drugs are mentioned in case write-ups from emergency rooms in the United States and Canada. And in 1992, there were 20 mentions of GHB. By 1998, it was over 1,000, almost 1,300 occasions. So it is a drastic increase over 6 years. So it may be rising. With continual use, tolerance can develop to several different effects of GHB, the motor impairment, the sedation, and then the anesthetic effects. And then if that leads to, if continual use can lead to dependence, then a sudden stop in use, sudden discontinuation can lead to withdrawal symptoms, which include anxiety and tremor, insomnia, agitation, delirium, and hallucinations. And then GHB can also help alleviate withdrawal symptoms from alcohol and from opiates. Our last slide. Our last drug is methadone. This is a synthetic stimulant. It's empathogenic. It causes empathy for other people. It causes a feeling of connectedness to other people. It's relatively new. It became popular within the past decade. The book lists 2007 as when it became available on the internet for purchase. It has effects similar to stimulants. So those are cocaine and amphetamines and cat, which we talked about several weeks ago. Those effects are euphoria, energy, confidence, things like that. It can be taken a variety of ways: snorted, smoked, injected, or taken orally. And it interacts with dopamine and serotonin transporters, blocking the reuptake of those neurotransmitters. Again, similarly to how the stimulants work, if you want to review that. So in the UK, it was reported as the 4th most popular club drug in the club scene by this magazine in England and Britain. And it's most commonly used by young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds, especially on the club scene. Because it's relatively new, its long-term effects are unknown, but they're likely similar to ecstasy and amphetamines. People have been seen to have anxiety, tachycardia, which is an elevated heart rate, and seizures from use of this drug. The legal status of methadone, it's now a Schedule I drug, which means that it has abuse potential and no medical use.